I gave the greedy heirs exactly what they wanted. Then their lawyer read a single sentence and forgot what he was about to say next. The conference room fell so quiet that I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioner above us. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I was 72 years old that morning, and everyone seated around that polished oak table believed I had finally surrendered. My son Daniel sat across from me wearing the confident smile he reserved for business deals. Beside him was his wife, Vanessa, dressed in cream-colored designer clothes that probably cost more than my first car. They looked relaxed, almost relieved. To them, this meeting was simply the last formality standing between them and everything they thought they deserved. Harold Green, our family attorney for more than 20 years, adjusted his glasses and continued reading from the document in front of him. The first several pages went exactly as Daniel and Vanessa expected. They exchanged small glances. Tiny smiles. Barely noticeable nods. Anyone watching would have assumed they were trying to remain respectful. I knew better. I had spent enough years around family dinners and holiday gatherings to recognize the look of people counting money that did not belong to them yet. I sat quietly with my hands folded in my lap. I did not argue. I did not interrupt. I did not correct a single assumption they had made about me during the previous 6 months. That was the part they never understood. They mistook silence for weakness. They mistook patience for surrender. And they mistook kindness for blindness. Harold turned another page. His voice remained steady as he read the next section. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Vanessa crossed one leg over the other and glanced briefly toward the large window overlooking downtown Chicago. The meeting was proceeding exactly the way they wanted. Then Harold reached the final page. I watched his eyes move across the text. I watched his expression change. The color drained from his face just slightly. His mouth stopped moving. For the first time in the entire meeting, he looked directly at me. Daniel noticed it too. Is something wrong? He asked with a nervous laugh. Harold did not answer immediately. He reread the sentence. Then he removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly with a handkerchief. The room suddenly felt smaller. Vanessa shifted in her chair. Harold, she said. What does it say? Harold looked back down at the page. Even after all his years practicing law, he seemed genuinely surprised. I simply smiled. Not because I was happy. Not because I enjoyed what was coming. But because I finally understood something that had taken me far too long to learn. The truth does not need to shout. Sometimes it only needs one sentence. Harold cleared his throat and prepared to continue. Before he spoke, I looked at Daniel. My only child. The boy I had raised. The boy who once held my hand crossing busy streets and cried when I left him at kindergarten. Now he looked at me like I was an obstacle standing between him and a larger inheritance. The realization no longer hurt the way it once had. Some wounds eventually become lessons. As Harold opened his mouth to read the final provision, every person in that room leaned forward. None of them knew that the real story had started 6 months earlier, on an ordinary afternoon when I overheard a conversation they never intended me to hear. 6 months earlier, my world still looked normal from the outside. I lived alone in the same brick colonial house Robert and I had bought 37 years ago on a quiet street lined with maple trees. Every morning, I followed the same routine. I made coffee in the blue ceramic mug Robert had given me on our 25th wedding anniversary. I watered the flowers on the back patio. I read the newspaper at the kitchen table while the sunlight spilled through the windows. The house was quieter after Robert passed away, but I told myself that was simply part of growing older. Grief had a way of settling into empty rooms. Some days it sat beside me like an old friend. Other days it followed me from room to room like a shadow. Daniel visited less often than he used to. At first, I made excuses for him. He had a demanding career. He had responsibilities. He had a family of his own. That is what parents do. We explain away disappointments because the alternative hurts too much. Vanessa always had a reason as well. They were busy. Their schedules were full. The grandchildren had activities. There was always something. Yet I noticed small changes. Daniel no longer called just to talk. Every conversation seemed to revolve around practical matters. Insurance policies. Property taxes. Home maintenance. Investment accounts. At first, the questions sounded innocent. Then they became more frequent. One Sunday afternoon, they came over for lunch. I had spent most of the morning preparing Daniel's favorite meal, the same roast chicken dinner I had made since he was a teenager. The dining room felt warm and welcoming. Vanessa complimented the food. Daniel complimented the house. Everything appeared normal. But something felt different beneath the surface. While we ate, Vanessa asked whether I had considered downsizing. She smiled when she said it. Daniel nodded in agreement. They spoke as though they were concerned about my future. The house is a lot for one person, Margaret, Vanessa said. Think about how much easier life would be in a smaller place. Daniel added that property values were high and it might be a good time to sell. I smiled and changed the subject. Still, the conversation lingered in my mind long after they left. During the following weeks, similar discussions kept appearing. Sometimes it was the house. Sometimes it was my savings. Sometimes it was the trust Robert and I had established years earlier. The questions arrived disguised as concern, but each one seemed to circle the same destination. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. I was in the upstairs hallway when I heard voices coming from the kitchen below. He thought I was still in the laundry room. Vanessa was with him. Their words drifted upward through the house. I could not hear everything. Just fragments. Small pieces of a conversation. But sometimes a few pieces are enough. I heard my name. I heard the word inheritance. I heard Vanessa say, "We need to be patient a little longer." Then Daniel laughed softly and replied, "Once everything is settled, none of this will matter anyway." I stood completely still. My hand rested on the banister. Rain tapped against the windows. For several seconds, I could not move. The words themselves were not dramatic. There was no shouting. No cruel insult. No obvious betrayal. Yet something deep inside me shifted. For the first time, I stopped listening to what they said around me and started paying attention to what they said when they thought I was not there. And that decision would change everything. After that afternoon, I stopped dismissing my instincts. For years, I had trusted the people closest to me without question. Robert used to tell me that kindness was one of my greatest strengths. Perhaps he was right. But kindness without awareness can become an invitation for disappointment. Over the next several weeks, I paid closer attention. I did not confront Daniel. I did not question Vanessa. I simply listened. It is remarkable how much people reveal when they believe nobody is paying attention. The phone calls became more frequent. Daniel suddenly seemed interested in details he had never cared about before. He asked about the mortgage even though the house had been paid off for years. He asked whether I still had the original trust documents. He asked if I had updated any beneficiaries recently. Every question sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they painted a different picture. One evening, Daniel invited me to dinner at his house. It had been months since he had extended an invitation, so I accepted immediately. I arrived carrying a homemade apple pie. Vanessa greeted me warmly at the door. The grandchildren hugged me. For a moment, everything felt normal again. We sat around the dining room table, laughing and sharing stories. I almost convinced myself that I had imagined the conversation I overheard. Then dessert was served. Vanessa casually mentioned a friend whose mother had moved into a retirement community. She described the place as wonderful. Spacious apartments. Planned activities. Restaurant-style dining. No maintenance responsibilities. Daniel immediately joined the conversation. He spoke enthusiastically about how much easier life could be in a place like that. I noticed they never asked what I wanted. They only described what they thought I should want. I smiled politely and took a bite of pie. The subject changed, but the feeling remained. A few days later, I received a call from my bank manager. We had known each other for years. He wanted to verify a request regarding one of my accounts. The request had not come from me. It had come from someone claiming to be assisting with future estate planning. Fortunately, no changes had been made. The bank followed proper procedures. Still, the conversation left me unsettled. When I asked for additional details, the manager hesitated. Professional rules prevented him from sharing much information. Yet his tone suggested concern. That evening, I sat alone on the back patio watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The air smelled like freshly cut grass. Children rode bicycles somewhere down the street. Everything looked peaceful. Yet I could not shake the growing realization that something was happening around me rather than with me. I thought about Robert. He had always been observant. He noticed details other people missed. If he had been sitting beside me that evening, he would have told me to stop ignoring the evidence in front of me. The following Sunday, Daniel and Vanessa visited again. This time, I watched them carefully. Their eyes wandered through the house. They commented on furniture, paintings, antique pieces Robert and I had collected during decades of marriage. They spoke about value more than memories, price more than sentiment, investment more than family. I began noticing how often Vanessa asked questions about specific assets. Not because she loved them. Because she wanted to know where they would end up. The realization was painful, but it was also clarifying. Sometimes the truth arrives gradually. It does not explode into your life. It settles quietly into place one piece at a time until the entire picture becomes impossible to ignore. By the end of that month, I no longer wondered whether something was wrong. I knew it was. What I did not know yet was how far their plans had already progressed. The answer arrived on a Tuesday morning inside an envelope that was never meant for me to see. The envelope arrived with the rest of the morning mail. At first, I almost tossed it aside without opening it. The return address belonged to a financial consulting firm I did not recognize. I assumed it was another advertisement. Yet something about it caught my attention. Perhaps it was the fact that my full legal name appeared beneath a reference number. Perhaps it was instinct. Whatever the reason, I carried it into the kitchen and opened it while my coffee was still hot. Inside was a packet of documents. Most of them appeared to be standard financial planning materials. However, one page stopped me cold. My name was listed as part of a proposed long-term asset transition strategy. I read the page twice. Then a third time. Several sections referenced future ownership transfers, estimated property values, and projected inheritance distributions. None of that should have existed. I had never authorized such planning. I had never attended any meeting related to it. Yet there it was in black and white. More troubling was the date. The document had been prepared months earlier, shortly after Robert passed away. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the pages. Outside, a lawnmower hummed somewhere in the neighborhood. Birds moved through the maple trees beyond the window. Ordinary sounds continued as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. For the first time, I realized I was not imagining things. The pattern was real. Someone had been discussing my future without including me in the conversation. I examined every page carefully. Most of the information was incomplete. Some sections contained estimates rather than facts. Yet certain details were accurate enough to make me uncomfortable. Information about assets that very few people knew existed. Investment accounts Robert and I had maintained privately for years. Personal information that should never have appeared in a planning proposal created by strangers. I folded the documents neatly and placed them back inside the envelope. Then I did something I had not done since Robert's funeral. I opened the cedar chest in our bedroom. Inside were decades of records, letters, legal files, and personal notes. Robert believed in keeping thorough records. At the time, I used to tease him about it. That afternoon, I silently thanked him. For several hours, I reviewed paperwork. Trust agreements. Property deeds. Financial statements. Handwritten notes. The deeper I looked, the more I appreciated how carefully Robert had organized everything. By early evening, I understood something important. The picture Daniel and Vanessa seemed to have built in their minds was incomplete. They believed they understood the full extent of our estate. They did not. They knew enough to be interested. Not enough to be informed. That distinction would matter later. During the following days, I watched them differently. I noticed how conversations always drifted toward future plans. Future ownership. Future decisions. Everything focused on what would happen after certain events occurred. Almost nobody asked what I wanted those years to look like. One Saturday afternoon, Vanessa stopped by unexpectedly. She brought flowers and a cheerful smile. We sat together in the sunroom drinking iced tea. At one point, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Her voice sounded warm and caring. She said she only wanted what was best for me. Then she spent nearly 20 minutes explaining why maintaining such a large property was becoming impractical. I listened quietly. The contrast fascinated me. Her words spoke about my comfort. Her questions focused on my assets. When she finally left, I stood at the front window and watched her drive away. The envelope still rested inside my desk drawer. The documents had answered one question but raised another. I now knew something was happening. What I did not know was who had started it. That answer arrived sooner than I expected when an old friend of Robert's called and asked if we could meet privately. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon. I recognized the name immediately. Thomas Caldwell had been one of Robert's closest friends for more than 30 years. They had worked together, invested together, and spent countless weekends fishing at a small lake in Wisconsin. After Robert passed away, Thomas checked on me occasionally, but he was not the type of man who called without a reason. His voice sounded hesitant. He asked if we could meet for coffee. Not tomorrow. Not next week. That afternoon. Something in his tone told me this was important. We met at a quiet cafe a few miles from my house. The place smelled like fresh coffee beans and cinnamon pastries. Thomas arrived early. By the time I walked in, he was already seated in a corner booth staring into a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The moment I saw his expression, I knew this conversation was not going to be easy. We exchanged a few pleasantries. Then he got straight to the point. He told me that several months earlier he had attended a charity event where he unexpectedly ran into Daniel and Vanessa. At first, everything seemed normal. They chatted politely. They discussed family. They spoke about business. Then the conversation shifted. Thomas said they began asking questions about Robert's investments. Not general questions. Specific questions. Questions about assets, trusts, and properties that most people did not even know existed. Thomas admitted that he initially assumed they were simply trying to help me manage things after Robert's passing. But the more they talked, the more uncomfortable he became. According to Thomas, Vanessa seemed especially interested in timing. How long certain legal processes typically took. How quickly assets could be transferred. Which holdings generated the most income? The details disturbed him. Not because of any single question. Because of the pattern. He looked at me carefully before speaking again. Then he told me something I would never forget. Margaret, they did not talk like family members worried about your future. They talked like investors discussing an acquisition. The words settled heavily between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside the cafe window, traffic moved steadily through the intersection. People walked by carrying shopping bags and talking on their phones. Life continued as usual. Yet inside that small booth, another piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. Thomas reached into his briefcase and removed a folded piece of paper. He explained that he had written down some notes shortly after that event because the conversation had bothered him. He handed me the paper. Several comments were listed. Most were harmless. One was not. Vanessa had apparently joked that the family fortune was trapped behind one final signature. Even reading the sentence months later made my stomach tighten. Thomas apologized for not speaking sooner. He said he had spent weeks convincing himself he might have misunderstood. He wanted to believe the best about my family. I understood. I had spent months doing exactly the same thing. We sat together for nearly an hour. By the time we finished talking, I no longer felt confused. I felt certain. The concern I had been sensing was real. The pressure surrounding my finances was not accidental. The conversations were not random. There was intention behind them. Careful intention. Yet oddly enough, I did not feel angry. Not at that moment. What I felt was clarity. For months I had been reacting to scattered pieces of information. Now the pieces were beginning to connect. When I returned home that evening, I placed Thomas's notes beside the documents from the mysterious envelope. Then I opened Robert's old desk and removed a business card I had not touched since his funeral. Printed on the card was a familiar name. Harold Green. Family attorney. The next morning, I called his office and requested a private appointment. What happened during that meeting would change the course of everything that followed. Harold's office looked exactly the way I remembered it. Dark wood shelves lined the walls. Framed certificates hung neatly behind his desk. The grandfather clock in the corner still ticked with the same steady rhythm it had years earlier when Robert and I first created our estate plan. Some things had not changed. Unfortunately, people had. Harold greeted me warmly and asked how I was holding up. It was a simple question, yet it was the first time in months someone had asked about me instead of my finances. I sat down and placed the envelope from the consulting firm on his desk. Then I handed him Thomas Caldwell's notes. Harold read everything carefully. He did not interrupt. He did not rush. When he finally looked up, his expression had become noticeably more serious. He asked a few questions. Had Daniel ever requested copies of certain documents? Yes. Had Vanessa discussed future ownership arrangements? Repeatedly. Had anyone pressured me directly? Not exactly. At least not yet. Harold leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. Then he said something that stayed with me. Margaret, there is a difference between preparing for the future and trying to control it before it arrives. For the next 2 hours, we reviewed every part of the estate Robert and I had built together. The process was surprisingly emotional. Each document carried memories. The lake cabin we bought after Daniel graduated from college. The investment account Robert started with money he earned from weekend consulting projects. The charitable fund we established because we believed success meant little if it was never shared. Every page reminded me that these assets represented decades of effort, sacrifice, and dreams. They were not numbers on paper. They were chapters of a life. Harold eventually closed the final folder and looked directly at me. Then he asked a question nobody else had asked. What do you want, Margaret? I sat quietly for a moment. The answer came easier than I expected. I wanted respect. I wanted honesty. I wanted the people who claimed to love me to value me more than the things I owned. Harold nodded slowly. Then he explained that the estate documents could be updated if circumstances justified it. Everything would be completely legal. Completely transparent. Completely within my rights. Yet he also warned me against making decisions driven by anger. Anger creates short-term satisfaction. Wisdom creates lasting solutions. I appreciated that advice. The truth was I was no longer angry. Not in the way people might expect. The sadness remained. The disappointment remained. But the anger had faded into something calmer. Clearer. I told Harold I needed time to think. Over the following weeks, I continued living normally. I attended church on Sundays. I met friends for lunch. I worked in my garden. From the outside, nothing appeared different. Meanwhile, Daniel and Vanessa seemed increasingly confident. Their suggestions became more direct. Their questions became more frequent. They spoke as though certain future outcomes were already guaranteed. I never argued. I never corrected them. If anything, I became more agreeable. When Daniel mentioned simplifying my financial affairs, I nodded. When Vanessa talked about future planning, I smiled. They interpreted my calmness as acceptance. In reality, I was observing. Listening. Learning. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is allow people to reveal themselves completely. Eventually they stop pretending. Eventually they show you exactly who they are. And by the end of that summer, Daniel and Vanessa had revealed far more than they realized. The final decision came to me one evening as I sat alone on the back patio watching the sunset settle behind the trees. In that quiet moment, I knew exactly what needed to be done. The next morning, I called Harold and asked him to prepare a new set of documents. The changes were finalized quietly. No dramatic announcements. No family meetings. No emotional confrontations. Harold prepared the documents exactly as requested, and I signed them during 2 separate appointments over the course of several weeks. Afterward, life continued as normal, at least on the surface. Autumn arrived. The leaves along my street turned shades of gold and crimson. Neighbors decorated their porches for the season. Meanwhile, Daniel and Vanessa appeared more relaxed than I had seen them in months. Their confidence seemed to grow with each passing week. I suspected they believed events were moving in the direction they wanted. The interesting thing about assumptions is that people rarely keep them to themselves. Eventually they begin behaving as though their assumptions are facts. That is exactly what happened. Daniel started talking about future renovations. Not to his own house, but to mine. During one visit, he stood in the living room discussing possibilities. He mentioned opening up walls. Updating fixtures. Expanding the kitchen. Vanessa joined the conversation enthusiastically. She suggested replacing several pieces of furniture because they looked outdated. I listened quietly from my favorite chair. Neither of them seemed to realize how strange the conversation sounded. They were discussing changes to a home that still belonged to me as though ownership had already transferred. A few weeks later, I attended my granddaughter's school recital. After the performance, families gathered in the auditorium lobby. While speaking with another parent, I overheard Vanessa describing future plans. She spoke about family assets with surprising confidence. She referred to certain properties as long-term opportunities. She discussed potential income streams. More than once, she used the phrase "when everything is settled." Each time she said it, Daniel nodded. The two of them sounded less like family members and more like people reviewing an investment portfolio. Yet I remained calm. Every conversation strengthened my certainty that I had made the right decision. The most revealing moment arrived shortly before Thanksgiving. Daniel invited me to dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown. Vanessa was already seated when I arrived. The atmosphere felt unusually cheerful. They ordered a bottle of wine. They complimented me repeatedly. They asked about my health. They spoke about family unity. For most of the evening, the conversation felt almost rehearsed. Then Daniel raised his glass. He smiled and said he was grateful that everyone was finally on the same page regarding the future. Vanessa smiled as well. Neither one realized how much those words revealed. They believed the future had already been decided. They believed every important outcome was heading exactly where they wanted it to go. Looking back, I almost felt sorry for them. Not because of what was coming. Because they had become so focused on acquiring something that they stopped noticing what they were sacrificing along the way. Trust. Respect. Authentic relationships. Those losses never appeared on financial statements, yet they were often the most expensive losses of all. As winter approached, Harold contacted me with the final details. Everything was complete. Every document had been reviewed. Every requirement had been satisfied. Legally, nothing remained unresolved. All that was left was the formal meeting. The official reading. The gathering where everyone would sit around a table believing they knew how the story ended. During the days leading up to that meeting, Daniel and Vanessa seemed almost celebratory. Their optimism was impossible to miss. They smiled more. They spoke more confidently. They carried themselves like people standing at the finish line of a race they had already won. I never corrected them. I never hinted at the truth. Sometimes the clearest lessons arrive only after certainty turns into surprise. And on the morning of that meeting, as I looked out the window before leaving home, I realized they were about to learn a lesson neither of them would ever forget. The conference room was already half full when I arrived that morning. Harold's assistant greeted me politely and showed me to my seat near the end of the long oak table. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, and weak winter sunlight reflected off the glass buildings outside. The room smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. I settled into my chair and placed my handbag beside me. A few minutes later, Daniel and Vanessa entered together. They looked confident. More than confident. They looked relieved. Vanessa carried herself with the ease of someone who believed the difficult part was over. Daniel greeted me warmly, almost cheerfully. He asked how I was feeling. He offered to get me coffee. The sudden attentiveness might have seemed touching to an outsider. To me, it felt different. Not cruel. Not hostile. Simply calculated. They were already behaving as though a certain future had been secured. Harold entered shortly afterward carrying several folders. His expression remained professional and unreadable. If he felt any anticipation about what was about to happen, he did not show it. More family members arrived over the next few minutes. A cousin. A nephew. A few individuals connected to various trusts and family holdings. Quiet conversations filled the room until Harold finally took his seat at the head of the table. The discussions stopped immediately. Everyone turned toward him. Harold began by reviewing procedural matters. His voice was calm and steady. He explained legal formalities. He reviewed documentation. Page after page, detail after detail, everything proceeded exactly the way professional meetings often do. No drama. No surprises. At least not yet. As the reading continued, I watched the faces around the table. Daniel appeared increasingly comfortable. Vanessa occasionally exchanged small smiles with him. Neither one seemed nervous. In fact, they looked reassured by what they were hearing. Several provisions discussed asset allocations, property management structures, and financial responsibilities. Nothing sounded unusual. Everything appeared orderly. Predictable. Expected. The confidence around the table continued to grow. At one point, Daniel even leaned back in his chair and folded his arms comfortably across his chest. Vanessa glanced toward the windows and smiled faintly. They looked like travelers who could already see their destination. Meanwhile, I remained silent. I had spent months preparing myself for this moment. Not emotionally. Practically. There is a difference. Emotions can cloud judgment. Preparation creates clarity. Harold continued reading. One section addressed charitable commitments Robert and I had established years earlier. Another reviewed property arrangements. Another outlined financial distributions. Each provision was completely legitimate. Completely transparent. And completely consistent with what many people in the room expected. As the minutes passed, an almost celebratory atmosphere began to emerge. Not openly. Not enough for anyone to comment on it. But I could feel it. Expectations were quietly solidifying into certainty. Then Harold reached the final folder. The room grew noticeably quieter. Even those who had remained casually attentive suddenly focused more closely. Pages turned. Pens stopped moving. Chairs shifted slightly. Harold opened the folder and reviewed the contents one final time. For the first time that morning, I noticed the faintest hesitation in his expression. Not concern. Not confusion. Recognition. He knew what was coming next. Daniel noticed the pause as well. He smiled politely and asked whether everything was all right. Harold nodded. He adjusted his glasses and lowered his eyes toward the final page. The room became completely silent. Outside, traffic moved through the streets below. Inside, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Every assumption. Every expectation. Every private calculation had led to this exact moment. Harold drew a slow breath and prepared to read the final provision that would change the entire meaning of everything that had come before. Harold looked down at the page for several seconds before speaking. The confidence that had filled the room only moments earlier remained untouched. Daniel sat comfortably in his chair. Vanessa appeared almost relaxed. Around them, everyone waited for the final formalities to conclude. Then Harold began reading. His voice remained professional, but I noticed a subtle change in his tone. Every word seemed more deliberate than before. The provision started with language that sounded ordinary enough. It referenced family stewardship, fiduciary responsibility, and the preservation of values Robert and I had worked hard to build throughout our marriage. Several people around the table nodded as though they had heard similar language many times before. Then Harold reached the sentence. The sentence. The one that had caused him to pause. The one that changed everything. He read it slowly. Any beneficiary found to have intentionally pressured, manipulated, or attempted to influence the surviving spouse regarding asset transfers, inheritance expectations, or estate decisions would immediately forfeit all direct inheritance rights under the revised estate structure. Silence followed. Not confusion at first. Just silence. The kind that arrives when people hear something unexpected but have not yet understood its significance. Daniel blinked. Vanessa's smile disappeared. Harold continued reading. Supporting documentation, witness statements, financial records, and independent legal review procedures had already been completed and incorporated into the estate file. Any determination under this provision would be final and binding. The silence deepened. This time everyone understood. Daniel straightened in his chair. Vanessa turned toward Harold. For the first time all morning, uncertainty appeared on her face. Harold calmly opened another folder and referenced the supporting materials that had been assembled during the previous months. Notes. Records. Correspondence. Independent observations. Professional evaluations. Everything had been reviewed carefully and lawfully. Nobody had been accused unfairly. Nobody had been targeted without evidence. The process had been thorough. Daniel looked at me. Not with anger. Not yet. With disbelief. He seemed unable to reconcile the reality in front of him with the future he had already imagined. Vanessa asked a question. Harold answered it. She asked another. His answer remained the same. The provision was valid. The review process was complete. The outcome had already been determined. Several people around the table exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others lowered their eyes. Nobody seemed eager to speak. The atmosphere that had felt so confident earlier now felt entirely different. It was not the loss of money that changed the room. It was the realization that assumptions had consequences. Harold eventually finished reading the remaining provisions. The charitable foundation Robert and I had supported would continue expanding. Several educational programs would receive additional funding. Community projects we cared about would move forward. Resources would be directed toward people and organizations whose actions reflected the values the estate was intended to preserve. Everything had a purpose. Everything had a reason. When Harold finally closed the final folder, nobody spoke for several seconds. The meeting was over. The certainty that had entered the room that morning had vanished. I sat quietly and looked at my son. For a brief moment, I saw not the man who had spent months calculating future assets. I saw the little boy who once asked me to check for monsters under his bed. The memory saddened me more than anything else that had happened. Because money had never been the real issue. Trust was. Respect was. Love was. Those were the things that had slowly disappeared long before this meeting ever took place. I stood. Collected my handbag, and thanked Harold for his professionalism. Then I walked toward the door. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody knew exactly what to say. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because I had won something. Because I no longer needed to wonder who valued me and who valued what I owned. The answer was finally clear. And clarity, I discovered, was worth far more than any inheritance.